Stephanie Solomons, and my 3 goals for this presentation are to have a clear central idea, a clear specific purpose, and to not repeat my ideas as much. So I'm going to start this presentation by talking about ADHD, more importantly the definition, the experience, and treatment. So at the end of this presentation, I'd like you guys to be able to understand why learning about this is of value to you as an audience. So I would like to go in depth and explain what ADHD is, since it's a disorder that multiple people have, but they don't really understand what it is. And I'd also like to explain how it affects the brain and how you can tell if you have it. So who here has a diagnosis of ADHD? Then you will know that focusing seems almost impossible, and that you have constant energy and stimulation, and that one more extra thought means focusing becomes even more impossible. Sorry, I lost my place. It is a disorder where many parts of the brain don't work the right way. More importantly, like the activity parts of the brain and the neurotransmitters and dopamine, which I'll get into in a minute. Most people think that it's just in children, but it's not. Adults can have it too. They just know how to manage it more because it's a lifelong disorder and they've dealt with it for longer. So you can make it better by medicines and other treatments, such as behavioral therapy. So now I'm going to go into the 2 kinds of ADHD, which one is ADD, which is just attention, and the other is ADHD. ADHD is not being able to pay attention and the hyperactive piece. So this means being more impulsive, not being able to finish a task as easily, interrupting people a lot, and it's harder to function. This is because of genetic causes and the causes of the outside environment. However, the main difference with people with ADHD and people without is their neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters send messages from one neuron to another, which help the brain function. They also release certain chemicals in the brain, and with ADHD, it's harder to make as many chemicals as needed to release them, so it causes multiple problems. So they can't manifest as many of these chemicals as they so-called need. However, it's not only that, these affect your genetic hormones now because you can't manifest enough chemicals. In addition to that, it is genetic and it does last a whole lifetime. It's not like your symptoms just go away. They become more manageable, but it doesn't just go away. So it is treatable, and it does affect the brain in more ways than I just named. One of those ways is because of dopamine, DRD4. Dopamine is when one part of the brain sends messages to the other part of the brain, which affects moods, learning, and etc. This is by, WebMD from 2014, and the part about neurotransmitters that I just talked about is from neurogenesis.com. So back to dopamine. With research, we learned that we can target the right part of the brain with ADHD because of dopamine and because of DNA testing with chemicals and medicine. This is great because we are able to find medicines that work for different people. But the problem with medicine, even with the DNA testing, is that there's never just going to be one medicine for ADHD. That we're only closer to finding the right part of the brain because everybody reacts differently with every medicine, which makes it very hard to find the right medicine. But with the medicines, you're able to do more tasks, be less impulsive, interrupt less, be less fidgety. And while these medicines help, they don't really fix everything. They can sometimes make it worse, which I experienced firsthand. Your anxiety can go up, you can get more fidgety, and it could become almost impossible to focus. It also brings you side effects. You can have stomach problems, you can have headaches, you cannot eat enough. These are all things to consider when choosing a medicine. if you go that route of treatment. And then there's also behavioral therapy, which I'm not really going to talk about during this presentation. So you become more functional and able to procrastinate less and able to do things that you wanted to do with this medicine. So how does it affect other disorders and you socially? So ADHD is the root of many other disorders. So it stems from disorders such as OCD, anxiety, depression, a learning disability, which is what I have, and it makes doing work almost impossible because you rush through it and you don't really take the time to think about what you're doing. From a social standpoint, you say multiple things without actually thinking about what you're saying, the consequences of what you're saying, how it affects people emotionally, and how it's going to affect people in general. Kind of only think about you, and you have a harder time seeing how these actions affect every single person around you until afterwards when it hits you, and then you can't do anything about it. So how does it affect people when doing work? From personal experience and from my educational profile, I realized that it makes me rush a lot more. It's harder to retain information because you're looking forward to getting the assignment done, and it increases anxiety. So knowing that you have ADHD, how can you figure out, knowing what it is, how can you figure out if you have it? Most people do it by an evaluation and by their behaviors. You also realize that if you have many disorders such as OCD, anxiety, a learning disability, depression, that you should be tested for ADHD because most likely you probably have that too. Your parents or people around you will normally know that you have it by the age of 4. And it also depends on how severe your behaviors are and what your background is. If you have a background where stressful stuff is happening at home, it normally increases the likelihood of having ADHD. So knowing this, it proves that ADHD is not a life or death situation, but it is an increasing problem that most of the population is dealing with. You should also realize from this last paragraph that when people have ADHD, it's not normally just ADHD. There's other stuff that go along with ADHD, which makes it harder to deal with. So the first step in dealing with it is to be aware of what your actions mean to other people and find strategies to help you do work and to make your life easier. ADHD, in conclusion, can be manageable if you know what it is and strategies that work for you, which is why this information is of value to you, the audience. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Are there any comments or questions at this time?